The rain poured in torrents, a cacophonous symphony of torment, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room. Thunder roared overhead, shaking the house to its very foundations. I had always found solace in the solitude of my home, but tonight it felt different. The usual comfort had turned into a haunting unease that crawled beneath my skin. My wife Emily had gone on a business trip, leaving me alone for the week. I was never particularly fond of the dark, stormy nights, but I couldn't escape them. With each flash of lightning, I caught glimpses of the sprawling forest beyond our backyard. The trees, their branches gnarled and twisted, seemed to reach out to me in the darkness. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread and convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I switched on the television, hoping the mindless chatter of a late-night talk show would distract me. But the TV screen flickered and distorted, and I heard faint whispers emanating from the static. Panic welled up inside me as I scrambled to turn it off. This couldn't be happening. It had to be the storm interfering with the signal. With the TV silenced, the only sounds were the relentless rain and the sporadic thumps of the branches against the window panes. I needed to get my mind off the unsettling atmosphere, so I decided to make some hot tea. The kitchen was located at the back of the house, facing the ominous forest. As I entered, I couldn't help but glance out the window. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by the curtain of rain. My heart raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the figure remained, motionless, and something about it sent shivers down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the storm and my isolation. I filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove, then turned to retrieve a tea bag from the cabinet. That's when I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, like wet leaves being crushed underfoot. Panic seized me as I glanced back toward the window. The figure was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the window cautiously, my breath misting the glass. I peered out into the forest, straining my eyes to see through the relentless rain. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. I convinced myself that my imagination was playing tricks on me, that the storm was messing with my senses. Comfort. I took a deep breath, attempting to steady my nerves. But then the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Panic set in once more as I fumbled for my phone, my only with trembling hands. I brewed the tea, hoping it would bring some warmth and source of light. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the fuse box in the corner of the kitchen. As I opened the fuse box, I realized that all the switches were in the off position. I couldn't fathom how that could have happened. I flipped them back on, but before I could make it to the kitchen light switch, I heard a voice, Emily's voice, faint and distant, calling my name from somewhere in the house. John, where are you? My heart froze. Emily was supposed to be hundreds of miles away on her business trip. I had spoken to her just before she left. This couldn't be her. It was impossible. The voice grew louder, more urgent, and I followed it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. John, please, help me. I ascended the stairs, each step echoing with dread. The voice led me to our bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest, and there, lying on our bed, was Emily. But it wasn't the Emily I knew. Her face was ashen, her eyes vacant, and her voice, a grotesque parody of my wife's, continued to call out to me. John, why did you leave me? I stumbled back, horrified by the sight before me. It couldn't be her. It had to be some cruel trick, a manifestation of my fear. I tried to speak, to reason with the apparition, but the words caught in my throat. The room grew colder, and a sense of malevolence hung in the air. The Emily thing on the bed began to levitate, her limbs contorting in unnatural ways. I turned and fled from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I had to get out of the house, away from the horror that had taken hold. As I rushed down the stairs, the house seemed to come alive with sinister whispers. The walls pulsed and the floorboards creaked under an invisible weight. I reached the front door and fumbled with the lock, desperate to escape the nightmare within. But as I opened the door, I was met with a sight that chilled me to the bone. The forest outside was no longer a dark and distant threat. It had crept right up to my doorstep. The gnarled trees loomed over the threshold, their branches forming grotesque shapes that reached out toward me. I was trapped, surrounded by the very darkness I had feared. And then, from the depths of the forest, I heard it. A chorus of voices, all distorted and filled with malice. They whispered my name, promising horrors beyond imagination. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing, and locked it with trembling hands. I'm writing this now in the dim light of my phone, huddled in a corner of the living room. I don't know what's happening, or if I'll ever escape this nightmare. The house is no longer a refuge. It's become a prison of horrors, and I'm being hunted by something I can't comprehend. All I know is that I'm not alone, and whatever lurks in the darkness wants something from me, something I can't give. The sound of the front door clicking shut echoed through the empty house, leaving me alone in the dimly lit foyer. My parents had gone away for the weekend, leaving me to fend for myself in our old, creaky house. As I watched their car disappear down the winding driveway, a feeling of unease settled over me. I had never been completely alone here before. I tried to shake off my nerves and distract myself by heading into the kitchen to make dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables was the only sound in the house as I prepared a meal for one. I glanced at the clock on the wall, and it read 7:30 p.m. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the darkness outside pressed against the windows, casting eerie shadows throughout the room. I tried to convince myself that I was being silly, that there was nothing to fear in my own home. But as I continued to cook, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Every so often I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The unease grew with each passing minute, and I decided to retreat to the safety of my bedroom. I climbed the creaky stairs and entered my room, closing the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. I knew I was being irrational, but the feeling of being alone in the dark was overwhelming. I turned on the television, hoping that the noise and the glow of the screen would provide some comfort. As I settled in, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the wall next to me. It was as if something was trying to claw its way out from behind the plaster. I froze, my eyes locked on the wall. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear a low, guttural growl. Terrified, I jumped off the bed and backed away from the wall. The scratching and growling continued, and it was clear that whatever was making the noise was getting closer. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. My hands trembling as I tried to explain the situation to the operator. "Please, you have to send someone. There's something in my wall," I pleaded, my voice shaking. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. The scratching and growling continued, and I could hear faint whispers coming from the wall. It was as if the house itself was alive, conspiring against me. Finally, the sound of sirens approaching broke through the terror. I let out a sigh of relief as I heard the police car pull into the driveway. 2 officers entered the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I led them to my bedroom, where the scratching and growling had reached a fever pitch. One of the officers knocked on the wall, and the noise immediately stopped. They exchanged puzzled glances before beginning to inspect the wall, tapping it and listening for any signs of disturbance. But the wall appeared to be solid, with no hidden passages or openings. The officers assured me that there was nothing in the wall, and that I must have been hearing things. They suggested that it might have been a raccoon or some other animal outside, making the noise. I wanted to believe them, but the feeling of dread still clung to me. As the officers prepared to leave, I thanked them for their help and walked them to the front door. But as I closed the door behind them, I realized that something was terribly wrong. The house had fallen eerily silent, and the air felt heavy with malevolence. I crept back up to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching and growling had returned, louder and more menacing than before, and the whispers were back too. Only now they were clearer, as if beckoning me to listen. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a hammer from my tool chest and began to tear into the wall. I had to know what was hiding behind it, what had terrorized me for hours. The drywall gave way, revealing a dark, narrow space that stretched deeper into the house. I shone my flashlight into the void, and my blood ran cold. It was a tunnel that shouldn't exist. And at the far end, I could see a figure huddled in the darkness. It was a grotesque, twisted thing, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It hissed and bared its sharp, yellowed teeth as I approached. I swung the hammer in a blind panic, striking the creature with all my strength. It let out a horrifying shriek as it crumpled to the ground, its body contorting and twisting in unnatural ways. I struck again and again, not stopping until the thing was nothing more than a mangled, lifeless mass. I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the horror of what I had just witnessed. My house, my supposed sanctuary, had harboured something unspeakable. I knew I had to leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. As I fled the house, I couldn't help but wonder how long the creature had been there, hiding in the walls, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. And I couldn't escape the feeling that somehow it had been watching me all along, biding its time until I was truly alone. I always enjoyed the solitude of my quaint old house, nestled at the edge of a dense, eerie forest. It was my escape from the noisy, chaotic world outside. On this particular night, I found myself alone, my family away, on a trip. I relished the prospect of having the entire place to myself. The clock struck midnight, and the quiet of the house enveloped me. The only sounds were the soft creaking of floorboards beneath my feet, and the occasional whisper of the wind outside. I settled on the couch in the living room, a book in hand, and a cup of hot tea nearby. The dim glow of the table lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the room. As I lost myself in the pages, an unsettling sensation crept over me. It was as if a pair of eyes were watching my every move. I shook off the unease as mere paranoia and continued reading, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. With a sigh, I placed the book aside and stood up, convinced I needed to investigate the source of my discomfort. My footsteps echoed through the empty house as I made my way to the kitchen, where the window overlooking the forest lay. The curtains billowed gently, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting grotesque dancing shadows on the walls. I convinced myself that the rustling leaves were responsible for my unease. I returned to the living room, resolved to ignore my irrational fears. But just as I was about to pick up my book, the lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. My heart raced as I groped for my phone to use its flashlight. The harsh LED beam cut through the obscurity, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. I scolded myself for being so easily spooked. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the basement. As I descended the creaking wooden steps, the feeling of being watched intensified, and a chilling breeze swept past me, ruffling my hair. It was odd, as the basement had always been warm and stuffy. Reaching the bottom, I found the circuit breaker and flipped the switches back on. The lights in the house came back to life, flooding the rooms with their reassuring glow. Just as I was about to head back upstairs, I noticed a curious detail. One of the basement windows was wide open. My breath hitched as I approached it, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't remember leaving the window open, and the lock was still in place. A shiver ran down my spine as I peered into the inky darkness beyond. It was impossible to see anything in the impenetrable void of the forest. I quickly closed the window and locked it securely. My unease deepened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something had been down there. I decided to call the police, convinced it was just a trespasser, despite the remote location of my house. As I picked up my phone, I heard a faint, rhythmic tapping, sound coming from upstairs. My heart leaped into my throat. It was as if someone were methodically tapping their fingers on a surface. With trembling hands, I tiptoed up the stairs, the tapping growing louder and more insistent with each step. When I reached the top of the stairs, the source of the sound revealed itself. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, and the tapping was coming from inside. My heart pounded in my ears as I slowly pushed the door open. The sight that greeted me froze me in my tracks. My room was plunged into darkness, except for a flickering candle in the corner. Shadows danced wildly on the walls, and at the centre of the room stood a tall, hunched figure, draped in tattered grey rags. Its bony fingers tapped rhythmically on the wooden floor, and its head was hidden beneath a hood, casting its face into deep shadow. I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot as I watched the figure continue its eerie dance. Suddenly, it stopped, and its head slowly turned toward me. Though I couldn't see its face, I could feel its malevolent gaze boring into my soul. With a guttural, raspy voice, it whispered my name, Sarah. My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? Who or what was this intruder? Panic overwhelmed me, and I turned and fled down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the front door, I fumbled for my keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The house seemed to groan and shift around me, as if it were alive and malevolent. I finally managed to unlock the door and burst outside, gasping for breath. The moonlight illuminated the dense forest, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. But there was no sign of the hooded figure. I stumbled down the path, not daring to look back, and eventually reached the safety of a neighbour's house. The police arrived and searched my house, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. There were no signs of forced entry, and the basement window was still locked. They assured me that it was probably a prank or a result of my imagination running wild. But I knew what I had seen and heard was real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent lurked within the shadows of my home. My once beloved solitude had become a terrifying nightmare, and I knew that I could never truly feel safe there again. I had always loved the idea of being home alone, the freedom to do whatever I pleased without anyone watching or judging. It was a rare occasion, as my family was usually around, but on this particular evening, they were all attending a wedding out of town. I was thrilled to have the entire house to myself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided to make myself some dinner. I cooked up a simple meal and settled down on the couch with my plate and a good book. The soft glow of the lamp in the corner created a cozy atmosphere. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside and the distant hum of the city. It was the perfect evening, or so I thought. As I devoured the last few pages of my book, I suddenly became aware of an odd sensation. It was as if someone was watching me. I dismissed it as paranoia, the product of an overactive imagination spurred on by the spooky tales I often indulged in. Still, the feeling persisted, and I couldn't shake it off. I glanced around the dimly lit room, but everything seemed normal. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I shrugged it off and decided to take a shower, hoping the warm water would wash away my unease. In the bathroom, steam filled the air as the hot water cascaded over me. I closed my eyes and tried to relax. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart pounded in my chest and I quickly turned off the shower. My mind raced as I listened intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere within the house. My stomach churned with fear. I knew I was home alone, so who could possibly be walking around? My first thought was a burglar. I wrapped myself in a towel and tiptoed to the bathroom door. I peered down the dimly lit hallway, my heart still pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I had to find out who was in my house. I grabbed a heavy hairdryer from the bathroom counter, my makeshift weapon, and ventured out into the hallway. The house was in total darkness now, except for the faint moonlight streaming in through the windows. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the sound of the footsteps. They led me to the living room, where the lamp I had left on was now flickering ominously. I could see a shadowy figure standing in the center of the room. Panic welled up inside me as I realized that there was someone else in the house. My trembling hand tightened around the hairdryer, my only defence against the unknown intruder. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice trembling with fear. No response. The figure remained motionless, just a silhouette in the dim light. I mustered all the courage I had and took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I said, "Who's there?" Suddenly, the lamp went out, plunging the room into darkness. I gasped, my breath shallow and ragged. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it in the direction of where the figure had been. But there was nothing there. The room was empty. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized that the intruder had vanished into thin air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it all been a trick of my imagination? I decided to search the house, convinced that the intruder must have hidden somewhere. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent shivers down my spine. I checked every room, every closet, but found no sign of anyone. Exhausted and terrified, I retreated to my bedroom and locked the door. I sat on my bed, still clutching the hairdryer, unable to shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. As the hours passed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination brought on by my overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that something inexplicable had occurred in that living room. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I awoke the next morning, the sun was streaming in through my window, and the house was quiet and peaceful once more. I ventured out cautiously, half expecting to find signs of a struggle or a break-in, but there was nothing out of place. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Was it a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something even more sinister? I may never know, but one thing is certain. I will never look at being home alone in quite the same way again.